Good afternoon, everyone. Just thinking about this idea of the life having meaning. Well, life can be quite hard at times, can't it? I'm sure we've all had times in our own lives where we've struggled more than we have at other times. Sometimes life can be harder than at others, can't it? And some people, I think when we look around at other people around us, some people have it really hard, don't they? And there seems to be no apparent reason for why some people have things so much harder than others. And yet, by contrast, there are other people who seem to have everything so easy. Even what we might call something like a charmed life. You know, life is so good for them and everything comes easily to them without effort. And again, there doesn't seem to be any real apparent reason for why some people seem to have things easy and others have them very difficult. I think all of us throughout our lives pursue certain goals in our lives, don't we? We have goals in our lives to do with perhaps with our career or with our family. Maybe we want to generate some status, personal status in our life. Maybe we're interested in getting more money than we've got now, having more possessions. Some people might strive after fame. And we might put a lot of effort into trying to achieve the goals that we have in our lives, even if that goal is only a very simple goal, such as being able to put enough food on our table day by day. And life can seem like it's just a constant round of toil, can't it? Just trying to keep our heads above water, swimming against the tide, struggling to stay afloat. And when perhaps we might have a bit of time to stop for a moment and think about it all, I'm sure many of us have been moved to ask that question: what is the point of it all? Why all this struggle and toil in life? Why is, or why can life be so hard? Where's it all going? There's a famous quotation that perhaps makes us smile a little bit. Somebody once said, "Life is hard, then you die." You know, it's quite blunt, isn't it? It makes us smile, but is it really just that? Is that all there is to it? Is there no more point to life than that? And so we might be moved to ask that question: why are we here? Are we just some meaningless accident of chemistry? Are we just the random result of some gigantic cosmic explosion that happened so long ago? Are we just the accidental outcome of some molecules coming together and creating something that's got no more purpose to it than simply to perpetuate its kind and then die? And if that is all that there is to life, if it is just an accidental thing that occurred and there's no more point to it than that, then it's quite a depressing thought, isn't it? But when we look at life around us, there's so much more that seems to suggest that there is more to life. There's aspects of life that suggest that our lives is more than just a mere existence simply to perpetuate the species of humankind. Mankind in particular, in terms of life on this earth, is so much more than just a living organism. Because we're capable of so much more than just existing, aren't we? So why aren't we just like the rest of life on earth? Because much of life that we see around us does appear to have little more to its existence than simply to live, to reproduce and then die. We're little more than the aim of continuing their species. We know that human life is so much more than that, don't we? So why is it that we can reason? The animals can't, can they? Not to any sort of degree, anything close to what mankind can do. Why is it that we can appreciate beauty? I think it's fair to say that other creatures only see, when they look around at the world around them, they only see a source of food or shelter. But we see beauty in things, don't we? I wonder why that is. And we can create things. And once we've created things, we can look at what we've done and we can work out how to improve what we've created. We can develop them. We can make them better than they were before. We can advance our achievements. And what other creature on earth can do that? And just think, for example, about the birds. They've been creating nests, haven't they, for as long as we know, but they've never improved them, have they, to any appreciable degree? Not like we've done with our dwellings. We've made our homes stronger, haven't we? We've made them more secure, we've made them waterproof, we've added heating and hot and cold running water, and so many other things that we've done to develop the quality and the comfort of the homes that we live in. So why do we have this ability to create and improve and develop that no other creature has? And why is it that we can consider the meaning of life? Because I don't think any other creature sits down and scratches its head trying to figure out why they are there. But we can do that, can't we? So why? Now, this book in the Bible that we've read a chapter from, it's a little book that tackles these very questions about the meaning of life, and we've just read together that first chapter of the book of Ecclesiastes to introduce our thoughts for this afternoon. And this book of Ecclesiastes was written by a man who seemed to have everything that this world could offer. And yet, despite that, he was plagued by the feeling that it was all meaningless and pointless. So in this book, the book that he wrote, he asks that question: what is life all about? And there's a recurring expression that we find throughout this book, the expression under the sun. And we read it there, didn't we, in verse 3 of chapter 1, where he says, what profit hath a man of all his labour which he taketh under the sun? And when he uses this expression, if we were to go through the book and see the various times that he uses it, we can see that he seems to be referring to life as it is, life as it's lived by people as they go about their day-to-day lives living on this earth. And he uses this expression 29 times in this book as he expresses his thoughts on what to him seems to be the pointless existence of life on this earth if we choose to have nothing to do with our Creator, if we choose to live it just as life on this earth and nothing more. A superficial reading of the book can leave us with that feeling that the book itself is depressing and pointless. But if we look for the underlying meaning of what this writer is saying, we can see that the purpose of the book is to show us the dramatic contrast between life as it's lived without God and a life dedicated to God. It speaks many times about the vanity of life. In fact, the verse 2 of the chapter that we read speaks about vanity of vanities. All is vanity, he says. Modern translations of the Bible use alternative words such as meaningless or pointless. I can't remember the version that you read from. Did that say something slightly different?
I think it did. But,
never mind.
Striving after wind.
Yeah. And that is the opening premise of the book, isn't it? That life, as he says in verse 2, without God is meaningless and empty. And he goes on to illustrate this, doesn't he, in a number of different ways, some of which we've read in that first chapter. And he thinks about the endless cycle of life, doesn't he? About the endless pursuit of ambition. He speaks about the way people live their lives as if they'll never end, not thinking about the fact that life does come to an end. People who live their life to its fullest but forget that they're not going to remember a thing about it once it's all over. And I think we've thought about some of those things already, haven't we? But the writer concludes at the end of the book with what he sees as the answer to all these issues and what is the true meaning of life. So let's have a look at some of the things that he says. We've already read chapter 1, so just pick out one or two samples from that. How he talks about how things go on and on endlessly. One generation passes away, he says in verse 4, and another generation comes. So, people come, they go, they're born, they live and they die, and it's an endless cycle, isn't it? The sun rising and setting and going round and round and round, never ending. He talks about the rivers, and we know about the water cycle, don't we? How the water on the earth evaporates into the clouds and then it rains back onto the earth to be evaporated again back up into the clouds, and it goes round and round and round. And it's these sort of things that he talks about how life, just looking at it from that sort of perspective, does seem to be pretty well pointless. It's the endless cycle of life, coming and going endlessly, round and round continually, a never-ending process of things which are quickly forgotten as the next stage in the process comes round and it all starts all over again. And then he gives us his statement of intent, doesn't he? Telling us that in this book that he's written, he wants to try to figure out the meaning of life. Verse 13 of chapter 1, he says, I gave my heart to seek and search out by wisdom concerning all things that are done under heaven. This sore travail hath God given to the sons of men to be exercised therewith. I have seen all the works that are done under the sun, and behold, all is vanity and vexation of spirit. So what did he do then to try to achieve this seeking and searching out by wisdom all the things that he observed in the world around him? How did he start this process of investigation and discovery? Well, when we go into the next chapter, chapter 2, we see that he threw himself first of all into enjoying himself to the fullest extent. He threw himself into engaging in extravagant, indulgent pursuits, living life to the full. And to put it in sort of modern terminology, we could say that he'd won the lottery, this man, because he was the richest man, the most powerful man, and the wisest man on the whole earth at the time. So why not? Why not do everything he can to enjoy life to the full? What's the point of being who he was if he couldn't use his advantages to fulfill himself, and at the same time to try to answer this question that he's asking? And so we see in chapter 2 and verses 4 and 5, he talks about how he made great works, built houses, planted vineyards, made gardens and orchards, and planted trees in them of all kinds of fruit. In verse 7 he had servants and maidens, and had servants born in his house. So he built up a great company of workers in his employment to push forward all these projects for him. Verse 8, he gathered silver and gold and the peculiar treasure of kings. He heaped up massive profits for himself, financial profits, building on the wealth that he already had. In verse 9, he increased, he was great and increased more than all that were before him in Jerusalem. So he became famous, he became well respected, he became fabulously wealthy. He could have anything he wanted. Money was absolutely no object. And verse 10 tells us how he rejoiced in it all. Whatsoever mine eyes desired, I kept not from them. I withheld not my heart from any joy. For my heart rejoiced in all my labour, and this was my portion of all my labour. So he rejoiced in everything he was doing and loved the process of getting and advancing and becoming great in the world. And what did he find? Well, it's the same answer. In all this toil and labour and the getting and the rejoicing, he found, verse 11, that he looked on all the works that his hands had wrought and on the labour that I had laboured to do, and behold, all was vanity and vexation of spirit, and there was no profit under the sun. So he's saying that all the getting and the profit and the fame and the rejoicing was worthless, pointless, of no real value under the sun. Why? Well, it's that phrase, isn't it? Under the sun. Because he's saying that if everything about life, if everything about our life is to do with bettering ourselves under the sun, bettering ourselves in this life only as we live it out on the earth, then it's all pointless, he says. Why is it all pointless? And he goes on in verses 15 to 17 to say, Then said I in my heart, as it happeneth to the fool, so it happeneth even to me. And why was I then more wise? And I said in my heart that this also is vanity, for there is no remembrance of the wise more than of the fool for ever. Seeing that which now is, in the days to come, shall all be forgotten. And how dieth the wise man as the fool? Therefore I hated life, because the work that is wrought under the sun is grievous unto me, for all is vanity and vexation of spirit. So he's starting to come to a bit of a conclusion here, isn't he? He's saying that it was all pointless, it's all vanity, it's all vexation of spirit, or as most modern versions put it, vanity and grasping for the wind. He's saying that it was all just as pointless to try and reach out and take hold of the wind as it blows past. Just that's what all these pursuits were like. It's like grasping for the wind, something we can't get hold of. And pointless for one particular reason. What we read in verse 16. There is no remembrance of the wise more than of the fool forever, seeing that which now is in the day to come shall all be forgotten. And the wise man dies just like the fool. He's saying that life is only temporary. It's something that we all know, but perhaps we don't all face up to sometimes. And he's saying it doesn't matter who we are, how rich we might become, whatever our achievements might be in our lives, however famous we might become, in the end, we're all the same. And when we're gone, what was the point of all that struggling, he says, to better ourselves? No more point than grasping for the wind. And he goes on in this chapter to emphasize that the reason that life under the sun, life without God, the reason why it's so pointless is that life is only short and will end. And he asks, what then will happen to all those things that we've spent our lives labouring for? What good will it all have done for us? Well, this man, he was King Solomon, wasn't he? King in Jerusalem, about 3,000 years ago. That's when he wrote these words, but things haven't changed, have they? The world's just the same now as it was then. People are just the same as they were then. The technology that we have might be different. The things that we can do with the money that we might have changed, but people haven't altered at all, have they? The aims and aspirations are just the same, even if the ways to fulfill those aims and aspirations might have changed a little bit. People still admire those who've risen to heights of great personal achievement. Many lads, when they're young, look up to their football idols, don't they? And they aspire to be themselves a great footballer in the hope that they'll become famous and make their fortune. Or perhaps they might yearn to break into the pop music world and achieve greatness there. Girls perhaps might dream of becoming a top model or something like that. Other people might aim for the top job in a company, aiming for the bigger paychecks and working themselves half to death to try to achieve it. And maybe in the process sacrificing family life and friends along the way in order to get where they want to be. Or maybe for most people who are not quite as ambitious as that, they simply spend their time working a bit harder in their job to try and impress the boss in the hope that they might get a promotion and a bit more pay. And the very act of buying a lottery ticket is another manifestation of this same yearning for something better, thinking that life will be better if only. But it won't, will it? If we're not satisfied with life as it is now, we still won't be satisfied no matter how much more we get. Ecclesiastes chapter 5 and verse 10 pretty well says that, and I'm going to read it from the Good News Bible, which puts it rather nicely. It says, if you love money, you will never be satisfied. If you long to be rich, you will never get all you want. It is useless, it says, and I think that's rather nicely put, isn't it, and very apt. And as Jesus says in Luke chapter 12, he says, again from the Good News Bible, he says, watch out and guard yourselves from every kind of greed, because your true life is not made up of the things you own, no matter how rich you may be. So we're being told then, aren't we, that there are two kinds of life. That's what the Bible is telling us. There is life with God and life without God. And this book of Ecclesiastes was written to help us to see that life without God is meaningless and without hope of any sort. And it was written to encourage us to think about the alternative, to help us to try to put God into our lives and to listen to God's teachings through the Bible and to follow his ways, rather than simply filling our lives with things to satisfy the here and now. In the very last chapter of this book of Ecclesiastes, the writer sums up his findings in a couple of verses. It's chapter 12, the last chapter of the book of Ecclesiastes. In verse 1, he says, "Remember now thy Creator in the days of thy youth, while the evil days come not, nor the years draw nigh, when thou shalt say, I have no pleasure in them." And he follows those words with a graphic description of the aging process to remind us once again that this life is short and transient. And he's encouraging us to remember our Creator, to remember God who made us and put us on this earth. And he's encouraging us to think about, instead of putting God to the back of our minds or out of our minds altogether, he's saying that we should remember God in our lives. Remember that he's there. Remember that God has shown us a better way. Remember that he's given us a way that does have prospects, a way that is in stark contrast with the alternative that most of this book is talking about, the alternative of just trying to enjoy and get the most out of this short life. And he emphasizes it again in the last verses, verse 13 of this chapter. He says, "Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man." That's his conclusion. That's his assessment of what life is all about. That's his statement on the meaning of life. To fear God and to keep his commandments. And what does that mean? Well, it means to hold our Creator in reverence, doesn't it? To respect him, to respect his wishes, and to do what he asks of us to the best of our ability. I'm just going to go out of Ecclesiastes now for, I think it's our last couple of quotations. I'm going to look in Isaiah in chapter 45 for one of these. This is a passage there where God explains his reason for creating the earth and for creating life upon it. Isaiah chapter 45 and verse 18. Got the wrong chapter. Is it 46 and 18 or is it 44 and 18? 45 is right. Oh, I know what it is. I've got the wrong book. Turned too many pages and I got into Ezekiel. Alright, here we are. Isaiah chapter 45 and verse 18. There we go. "For thus saith the Lord that created the heavens, God himself that formed the earth and made it, he hath established it, he created it not in vain, he formed it to be inhabited. I am the Lord, and there is none else." And there we have that word vain again, same as the word vanity that we've been looking at in Ecclesiastes. But it's telling us that God didn't create life on earth in vain. He formed it for a reason. He formed it that people would live on this earth. Life was put on this earth so that it would be inhabited, that it would be a world full of life. It wasn't a meaningless, empty, purposeless act. God did it for a reason. And there are three passages that I won't ask you to turn up, I'll just read them out for you. Three passages that say similar things, that show us what that reason was. That it was more than just creating a world full of living creatures with no purpose to their lives other than to simply live. Habakkuk chapter 2, the prophet says, "For the earth shall be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea." And Psalm 72 says, "Blessed be his glorious name forever, and let the whole earth be filled with his glory." And in Matthew chapter 6 we have the Lord's Prayer that I'm sure most of us know, where we have the words, "Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, in earth as it is in heaven." So these are all telling us, aren't they, that the world was created with that purpose, to reflect the character of God himself, that it could be a world full of goodness and loveliness, just as God is, reflecting what he is like. Because we know the Bible tells us right at the beginning that the first human pair chose to go a different way. They chose to please themselves instead of pleasing God. They brought evil and ugliness into the world, and they failed to reflect that loveliness of God that he wanted them to do, and they became estranged from him. But the purpose of God hasn't changed. God will still bring about the time when the whole earth will be filled with his glory. It will be filled with God's goodness and God's loveliness. And his purpose with mankind is to seek out individuals who will seek for him, looking for people who will try to obey him, looking for people who will trust him and who will love him and will love his ways, and people who understand that God's way is right, that God's way is good. So life is a test. It's a test to see which way we're going to go. And the circumstances of life that we experience as life goes on, the events that come our way, sometimes hard, sometimes unpleasant, sometimes easy and enjoyable, but they're all there to see how we will respond, to see whether we will trust God, to see whether we will do what he wants us to do rather than what we want to do. And as I say, the first human pair failed that test, and all of us since have equally failed that test to a greater or lesser degree. So it's not a test about whether we'll succeed in doing right all the time. It's about where we will put our trust, whether we put our trust in God or in ourselves. The man who wrote the book of Ecclesiastes spent a lot of time, didn't he, putting his trust in the things of this life, trying to find fulfillment in those things, trying to find meaning in his life by pursuing all those ambitions and all those pleasures that life can offer. And he found it all turned out to be empty and meaningless. But his conclusion was that the real meaning of life was to put our trust in God. This life leads nowhere if this life is all that we care about. But a life with God in it has hope, it has prospects, and it is going somewhere. And that's where God wants us to find meaning in our lives, to realise that without him there is no hope, but to realise that coming to him opens up a way of true hope and a prospect of so much more to come. I think most people are familiar with the words of John chapter 3 and verse 16, which says that God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. And he's telling us in that verse that God loved the world, he loved the people of this world in this way, that he made the way possible through his Son Jesus Christ for all to come to God and to be saved from that hopeless and meaningless vanity of life without him that the book of Ecclesiastes describes, and instead come to him and find hope and the true meaning of life. A life with God in our lives, a life with hope, a life that can give us true peace and contentment with the prospect of an even better life to come. Thank you.